spring seminar series. Very happy to see you all. If I haven't met you, my name is Becca Nixon. I've been organizing the seminar series this semester. Got it. But most of the work has actually been done by a newly formed student organizing committee for the seminar series. So a huge thank you to so many of the students who've been inviting speakers, as well as the faculty who have been helping with a lot of the logistics as well. So huge shout out to the newly formed seminar organizing committee. Two things we do for seminar is we start our seminar series with announcements and a diversity share. So, and we're going to have Lindsay and Pinky talk a little bit about diversity share, what it is, kind of how it got started, because especially as a new faculty member last semester, I was really curious kind of the background. So just as a reminder of why we do it, we're going to have them share an example of it as well. But first of all, does anyone have any announcements? Announcements, as a reminder, this could be an event on campus that you want people to know about, a new paper that you just published, a shout out you want to give anyone in the department. Does anyone have any announcements? Yes, Lindsay.
Talking a lot at the beginning of today's seminar. I am so proud of students that are working with me. James Bryan has been accepted to the PhD program at USC Chapel Hill. Back from Tennessee, who is very interested in him. And Nathan Thayer has received an offer from Colorado Mesa for a tenured faculty assistant professor position.
Woo, woo, woo.
Yeah. Is Julie up here yet? I don't know. This successfully defended his dissertation.
Any other announcements? Yeah.
Katie is officially a PhD student.
Hey! Anything else? Okay, my announcement is that after seminar, we are going to be heading to happy hour with our speaker at Homegrown, so please make your way over there when we finish here. And then Lindsay and Pinky are going to share about diversity.
We used to be the seminar coordinators a while back, and then Kyle took over with me, but one of the things that you might not know about my role in the department is as part of my service on the diversity committee, our Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accountability Committee in the College for Social Environment, I am the diversity advocate for our unit. So that means that I try to keep us on top of things like the diversity chair, and if you have anything that you need me to bring to the diversity committee at the college level, I'm your person. So Pinky and I think we're the first, we can't remember if we were the first introduced to the seminar. In fact, we think we weren't, but we may have been, so here we are.
So the idea was to be more mindful of who we are as an academic, because many of you are probably going to stay in academia. Some of you might not. You will still be part of our society that has its inherent biases. So we thought it would be a good part of your training to know about it. And to initiate that, we thought we would be, sharing throughout the seminar series, and we have been sharing something that would be interesting or maybe sometimes heartbreaking actually to know, but it exists, so there's no point, staying away from it. To get you started for this semester, I would definitely urge all of you to read a new report that was published on NSF funding status. So if you do not know, National Science Foundation is one of the premier federal funding agencies that support our science. Many of you probably would submit NSF proposals as a student, as a DDRI proposal, or later on in your career. And the report came out that actually looked at who is being funded by NSF over the years. And I'm not going to spoil what's in that report, but I would definitely strongly recommend you to go find that report first. Another important training to find the link, and then read it, give it a very careful thought, and then if you think that's not right, what's happening right now, make something to change the system rather than just to fill into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay and Pinky. So that's an example of something you can bring to Diversity Share. It could be an event on campus. It could be something that you read about, heard about. We want this to be a place where we can share with each other the resources that we know about. This is one of the very, very few times, right, we're all in the same room together. So the Diversity Share is one opportunity to share what you know from your field, in your discipline, right, that one of us might not have encountered. And the announcements are a time, right, to shout out, tell us about events, tell us what's going on in your professional lives, because this is a unique opportunity for us all to be in the same room, or Zoom, if you're on Zoom as well. So with that, I do want to introduce our first seminar speaker, Dr. Jennifer Baka, here today from Penn State, where she's an associate professor of geography. She's an energy geographer focused on South Asia and the U.S., within the U.S. mostly looking at energy systems in Appalachia that we're going to be hearing more about today. And before joining faculty at Penn State, she was an assistant professor of geography and environment at the London School of Economics. She's been a consultant for the UN Environmental Program, worked in the energy industry as a consultant in DC, and recently she was appointed to the Environmental Justice Advisory Board for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So she has a rich variety of experience and expertise to share with us today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Going to click on the microphone and everything is going to work well. Right, seamless. Can you hear me in the back? Woohoo, excellent. And then now the true test. Will the slides advance? Are you able to see it? Oh, okay. Let's see. Are you able to? Is this good? Okay. This is such a fancy room. So thank you so much for having me. It's really nice. And I have 2 young kids, so this is basically like vacation for me. Just don't ask me to watch kids YouTube. And like if I say something that you disagree with me respectfully. Don't just like throw something at me and do a temper tantrum. All right, but thank you. That's all the jokes that I will bring to you today, because we are going to talk about this baby. Who knows what this is? Anybody here from the Pittsburgh area? All right. So this thing is an ethylene cracker plant. This has been opened as of November, about 30 miles to the northwest of Pittsburgh. Who knows what ethylene is? Yeah. Do you want to tell us?
I don't know the full details of it, but it's like a part of the plastics making process. It's sort of a basic polymer.
Yep, and how does it relate to natural gas?
It's made of natural gas.
Exactly. So this is a byproduct of natural gas manufacturing or natural gas processing. So from hydraulic fracturing, you basically take the ethane waste product out of the natural gas stream, and you can use this to manufacture plastics. And this is what they're doing in the Pittsburgh area now. This plant, I've been studying it for the last 6-7 years, and it just opened as of November. All right, so here's a little bit of information about it. You can see Pittsburgh down there in the red circle. You see the site of the ethane cracker along the Ohio River Valley up here. I should have put it on this one. I have it towards the end of the map. If you just go across the Ohio state border, that's the train that derailed in East Palestine last week. So this is a massive industrial expansion that's happening in the Pittsburgh area that I like to call fracking 2.0, okay? All right. And of course, this area of the Ohio River Valley has a long industrial history. This is just a map of the former steel mills of Western Pennsylvania. And so you see that the shell cracker plant, is right there in the heart of what had been formerly the steel belt and now rust belt of the Midwest. All right. So this plant was a big deal because what happens in these post-industrial towns, rust belt towns, you have politicians like Trump coming to town to say, hey, if you permit this plant, if you allow the drilling to happen, we're going to revitalize the area, bring back the good old days. Remember what your grandparents talk about, bring in the jobs. But don't worry about the environment because the jobs are coming. And essentially that's what Trump offered to the folks when he visited this site during the construction phase in August 2019. You see here the folks in yellow, those are all union workers, and they were told that day, come to this rally with Trump or you have to take a personal day. Right, but what did Trump say? He was characterizing this ethane plant and the ethane, which is the raw gas input here, saying that's the gold underneath our feet. When completed, this natural gas facility, this plastics facility that is derived from hydraulically fractured gas in Pennsylvania, that's going to manufacture plastics and ship plastics all over the world. And of course, it wouldn't have happened without him. And of course, when those plastics are transported, it's going to be stamped with Made in the USA. And, that's the branding for making America great again. And this is part of his discourse for trying to bring the coal jobs back to Appalachia. So part and parcel, the same thing. However, the history is much longer than Trump. Okay, so this plant cuts across partisan divides. Here's former Governor Wolf. He was a Democrat. He was the one who signed the permit that got this plant off the ground. And here's some announcements from him, right? So when he signed the permits, he said that, this is going to bring responsible industrial development to Pennsylvania, and they're going to, regulate it well, whatever that means. So keep a close eye on it. But what you heard in the news is that this was going to revitalize the Rust Belt by bringing in 6,000 construction jobs and 600 permanent jobs when the plant was operational. How did they get this plant into Pennsylvania? Well, Pennsylvania granted Shell, the owner and operator of this plant, the largest tax break in state history. We actually don't have the full details on the cost, but according to what we've been able to piece together, it's about $1.65 billion in tax breaks over 25 years. And then Shell counters that and says that, but we're investing $6 to $10 million to build this plant, right? So in some senses, it's the largest tax break, but then perhaps also the largest private investment, all for 600 permanent jobs. You can do the division there to figure out the cost per job, right? Lots of money. All right, I've been trying to make sense of this plant. So I've been going out to this region periodically over the last 7 years with the healthy COVID disruption here. What I'm going to present to you today is based on a good 8 stakeholder interviews I've done, going to industry conferences, which if you ever get enough money, go to them. They are circuses, very, very insightful events. I've been going to various components along this petrochemical build out and documenting and pouring through the regulatory process. And thankfully, I have sabbatical approved for next year, so I'm going to be spending a ton of time out there trying to make more sense of this plant, right? And what I want to do what I'm going to present to you today is something that came up, or an idea that was sparked in one of those interviews. So in speaking with one of my key informants, he said, the cracker plant is more than just the Shell plant, it's part of a bigger puzzle, but we don't know how it all fits together. I have a political ecology and an industrial ecology training by background, and when I hear a statement like that, that's what gets my mind buzzing, because I want to figure out what that puzzle is, right? And so that's what I'm going to present to you today in the talk. All right? So I'm going to talk about what is this puzzle? What is the cracker plant? What does it represent? I'm going to take you through what I like to call a metabolic tour. So how do we get from shale gas wells through polyethylene pellets? And what does this cracker plant represent politically, economically, and environmentally? Oh, there you go. Yes. Why has it come to Pennsylvania? And what does it mean for this region and the planet? Okay. And there, I just want to flag your attention to, a lot of the good work that National Geographic has been doing. And in the summer of 2018, they had an issue in which they're talking about the growing continent of marine plastics waste. So we need to be thinking about this revitalization, quote unquote, of the Rust Belt and how it may contribute to this growing ocean of plastic waste. Okay? So I'm going to do this analysis for you through a field that I've been contributing to in geography called political industrial ecology. I'm trying to bring together these two the streams of thought, the political ecology and the industrial ecology, because I think that they fit together nicely. Both of them are based on, a systems perspective, if you will. So if you take from political ecology, Blakey and Brookfield's original chains of explanation analysis, going from linking farmer actions on the ground to broader geopolitical forces, that's a supply chain approach in a sense. And then industrial ecology, you might not be as familiar, but I guarantee you know what it is without knowing that field. Life cycle assessment, environmental footprint analysis. That's industrial ecology. It's trying to think beyond the tailpipe, if you will, and the whole production chain of an industrial process and to track its environmental impacts. I try to bring these two together through the concept of metabolism, which is a shared theoretical framework in both fields. And I will take you through that metabolic tour so that we can try to embed this metabolism of the petrochemical corridor within its broader political and historical contexts. Okay? And you can, I would very much appreciate your feedback because this is the field I'm going to be working in extensively next year while on sabbatical. And I think it makes a lot of sense to bring these two fields into conversation because they're both normative at their heart. When you read Paul Robbins' undergraduate political ecology textbook, he's often talking about political ecology as a framework for environmental justice analysis, that there are more sustainable ways, less exploitative ways of engaging the world. Industrial ecology is doing the same exact thing. They want to try to figure out ways to minimize the environmental footprint of industrial society. Okay, so I think there's a lot of good synergies here. All right. And so, again, just trying to embed this metabolism in its broader political and historic context. And then I also think from a geographic perspective, we talk a whole heck of a lot about oil in resource geography, a lot less about natural gas and petrochemicals. We can't ignore them anymore, especially with the ongoing war in Ukraine. And as we'll get to at the end of the talk, these train derailments in Ohio. And I learned this morning, I taught my graduate seminar this morning, the Ohio derailment was one of 4 that has happened in this past week, but you've only heard of the Ohio one, right? Yeah, same with me. I didn't know about the other ones, but one of my students brought it up. So this is part and parcel of this build out. All right, so what is this cracker plant? All right, so here we go. This is your natural gas history 101. This is the Marcellus shale gas, the area in brown, that dividing line between the wet gas and the dry gas. That is industry lingo. Dry gas, when you bring the gas up from the subsurface, you're just getting methane, which is natural gas. Whereas wet gas is bringing in the natural gas liquid byproducts, the ethane, propane, butane. Before this cracker plant came to town in Pittsburgh, the industry had to flare off those natural gas liquids so that they can get the natural gas to a certain pressure point so that it can safely go through pipeline systems. That's a waste byproduct, if you will, to the industry. They don't want to lose money. So in a sense, you can view this whole petrochemical build out as their attempt to turn waste into value by creating this petrochemical corridor. Okay? And then they go through this process called cracking, hence the name of my talk, in cryogenic facilities. It's the opposite of oil refining. So instead of heating up petroleum products to a super high temperature, now you freeze them to a really low temperature. And then as you let them come back to room temperature, various gas byproducts fall out of the system. So it's the opposite of oil refining, right? You need separate facilities to do that. And then you can take that ethane out of the stream, and then you make these things that you see on the right here called ethylene pellets or nurdles, okay? So it's a building block of plastic. And I would argue with you that plastics are everywhere, right? This ethylene is ubiquitous. It's the most commonly used petrochemical in society. And it is, you can't go a day without touching the ethylene supply chain. So here is just some pictures of the products that contain ethylene. So carpeting, tires, diapers, your single-use plastics, okay? And how is it produced? Well, this is where I'm going to take you through this metabolic tour. All right. So with that, just remember that the plant is more than just a plant. And now I'm going to take you through the whole supply chain. So you have to start with the hydraulic fracturing wells. Here's a map of wells drilled in the Marcellus between 2004 and 2018. They're color-coded based on year. Over 12,000 wells have been drilled to date. And this is the unconventional wells, so hydraulic fracturing wells. For those who might not be familiar, that's when we go down horizontally and then go down vertically and then go out horizontally, all right? So a big revolution in natural gas production, okay? 12,000 wells is a big deal. That's a lot of infrastructure to be putting in, all right? And now, I talked a little bit about this cracking process, but what you have to do in order to get this get the ethane out of the supply chain is send them to these cryogenic facilities. Those are in the triangles all over here, okay? And as we've been building out this fractionation capacity in the western part, that wet gas region of the Marcellus, we've increased capacity about 27 times in a very short period in the Appalachian Basin alone. You got to get a lot of pipelines built to circulate these products, and you need a lot of separate pipeline infrastructures. So what I have here is just the natural gas pipelines that have been built throughout Pennsylvania. And this map is likely outdated because there's constantly new pipeline projects being proposed. One of the industry conferences that I attended, one of the speakers was talking about how we were leaving gas stranded in the field during the early days of the fracking boom because there wasn't enough pipeline capacity. So therefore, industry was working to expand the pipeline capacity, particularly to the western portion of the state, so we didn't leave gas in the field. You got to get it to market. All right, but as one of my graduate students poignantly likes to say, gas is a gas. Its job is to escape. How do you prevent gas from escaping? Well, you got to put compressor stations at regular intervals along those pipelines so you can keep it under pressure. So there are compressor stations about every 40 to 100 miles along these pipeline routes. Those are also a very big environmental footprint just in terms of the infrastructure space that they take up. But the climate science folks, you might be well aware that leaks from the natural gas infrastructure, particularly these compressor stations, is one of the largest sources of fugitive methane emissions. So if we want to solve the climate crisis, we got to harness this fugitive methane, right? Ethane needs to go through a whole other set of pipelines because we actually liquefy ethane because of its volatility. So that's a whole other set of pipeline infrastructure that's going into Pennsylvania. Here is one such ethane pipeline. This is the Falcon pipeline that is going through Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania to get the ethane from those fractionation facilities up to the Shell plant north of Pittsburgh. This is interesting because Shell built this pipeline in addition to the cracker plant, which is something that we don't typically see in the natural gas and oil industry. And then this is one of my favorite pieces of this scenario. Industry is also very hard at work trying to build storage hubs to park this ethane. And this is a map from the US Geological Survey where the circles represent likely places where they're going to build these underground parking lots to store the ethane. And these are all in former salt caverns because you need dry spaces, right? So, from an infrastructure perspective, there's a whole lot of changes afoot, both above ground and below ground to, make this petrochemical market viable in the Ohio River Valley. All right, and here's just a little bit of info on the Shell plant itself. And this speaks about industrial power in some senses. So the Shell plant is about 1,000 acres, and in order to clear the land to make this cracker plant, they literally bought up a couple of miles of highway and rerouted it. They felled a few thousand trees. They have expanded rail yards, which will become important towards the end. They're building barge and loading facilities on the Ohio River so that they can circulate these plastic nurdles to plastics manufacturing facilities. And then it's also important to note that the Shell plant is on the site of a former zinc smelter. So when I've gone and talked to communities, they have a negative perception of the zinc smelter, thinking that they were not a good neighbor, but they think that Shell is a good neighbor because Shell has a good PR machine and they go and sponsor the local Little League teams and they're very present in the community. Okay, so they think of Shell as a good neighbor. All right. Now, the political industrial ecology perspective. So I took you through the metabolism there. What happens when we put this all on one map? Okay, so I am a very bad geographer in some ways because I've never done GIS, but thankfully our department has great cartographers. So this map is thanks to our former grad student, current postdoc, Harrison Cole. He's a brilliant cartographer, as I hope you agree with me by looking at this map. So what I'm showing here, you see the Shell plant outside of Pittsburgh. But then you see the different petrochemical plants proposed for the Ohio River Valley. And importantly for this area, look at the pipeline infrastructure coming across to Marcus Hook in Philadelphia. I looked this morning, it's about 20 minutes north of here. That is significant because that terminal has been retrofitted so that we can export this ethane over to Europe, particularly Scotland, where they have a mature petrochemical facility in the north of Scotland. But then also this pipeline infrastructure goes up to Ontario, Canada, to Sarnia, where they also have an existing petrochemical manufacturing area. And then it connects into the ATEX pipeline network. That's significant because that's the main route to get down to the US Gulf Coast, where there's also a petrochemical hub. Right? So in some ways, you can look at this development as the key to unlocking those stranded assets, because now we have all these pipeline interconnections to get this ethane and natural gas to a much broader market. Right? Whereas prior to this, natural gas markets in the US were highly localized. Now they're becoming much more global, thanks to this build out. Yeah.
Just a quick clarification.
Yep.
There's a green pipeline already connecting Philadelphia to Houston, and then there's the dashed line. Does it mean that it's going to expand?
Yeah, or
it's going to be new?
So they proposed a second one because who knows about the Mariner East? The Mariner East has gone through, the history here. A whole lot of sinkholes opened up as they started to build it. And then this was also in and out of the news, but the FBI raided the DEP's office in Harrisburg because of potential bribery and corruption around the permitting of this Mariner East pipeline. Yeah, so then they've proposed an additional route to still build the pipeline, but build it more safely, whatever that means, right? And there's been a lot of protests to this build out because this pipeline right of way goes through the wealthier Philadelphia suburbs, right?
But it's not there today.
Nope. Nope. All right. So why this region? Why did it come to Pennsylvania? All right. So supposedly this wet gas region of the Marcellus is within 700 miles of 73% of US and Canadian ethylene demand. And then of course there's the potential for that job creation that we talked about before. But then I think importantly, this region has been in decline. It's the Rust Belt, a lot of underutilized infrastructure from one perspective, but then also a big demand for new jobs and infrastructure and industry to come into the area. All right. And Shell knew this and started playing the states along the Ohio River off of each other. So Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania engaged in what the media called the cracker sweepstakes. So Shell went around to each of the states using consultants who didn't tell that they were working for Shell, but just said, what kind of deal would you give us if we brought in a large-scale manufacturing facility that would bring all these jobs to the area? And Pennsylvania won. They offered the best tax break. That is not unique necessarily, because look at what Amazon and Tesla do. It's the same sort of, my colleague Chris Fowler said in economic geography, it's growth machine logic. I am not an economic geographer, but it's that idea that you constantly work with the local governments to get these tax breaks and concessions in return for the jobs. Okay? All right. And why here and now? Another slide. So this report was produced through Team Pennsylvania, which is this public-private partnership in which the state of Pennsylvania is actively going out and recruiting to try to find industries to come to Pennsylvania. And according to their estimates, they think that there's enough ethane reserves in that wet gas region of the Marcellus to bring in up to 5 similar petrochemical facilities to the Ohio River Valley. So the Shell facility could be one of up to 5 that could come to this area over the next couple of years. Baka mentioned that I worked at the LSE before coming to Penn State. I had no research budget there, but I still have to be productive as an assistant professor. I started coding congressional testimonies on fracking. We went through something like 400 testimonies, I think it was. I have testimony from Joe Manchin back in 2008 in which he said the way to revitalize West Virginia is to get these cracker plants to come into West Virginia. So it's no surprise to those in the know that this is happening, okay? And if this whole build out happens, that would represent a 25% increase in US ethylene production. So pretty sizable and significant. All right. Now let's pause and think theoretically for a while. So that's the empirics. So how can we explain this from a geographic perspective? And one way I think we can look at this is through the idea of the spatial fix. Let me just put it here. So building out those 12,000 wells, that is a boom in industrial development. And what happened? Well, as a result of that big boom in drilling, natural gas prices plummeted. What does a Marxist perspective on capitalism tell us? Capital likes to have a steady stream of profit, right? And so we don't want to have that collapse happen where profit plummets, but capitalism is quite savvy, so industries look for new ways to pivot. In this regard, you can think of this ethylene build-out as a pivot for creating new markets for natural gas, right? So we can justify having those 12,000 wells operating because we've created this new market for natural gas. And that's what David Harvey calls the spatial fix. And my undergrad students in political ecology took an exam on this yesterday. They understood that concept, but none of the other concepts in Marxist political ecology. So I did a poor job. All right. But then also, I'm an old waste junkie, given my history in industrial ecology and my dissertation work critiquing the heck out of the concept of wastelands in biofuel development in South Asia. And here's my hokey diagram that tries to conceptualize the really inspirational writings from Vinay Gidwani at the University of Minnesota. He talks about this relationship between waste value and common property land, arguing that all 3 of these components are essential to the perpetuation of capitalism. I mentioned briefly at the beginning that you can, in one way, conceptualize this petrochemical build-out as turning the waste stream of natural gas mining in the wet gas region as a way to turn waste into value. That's how we're seeing this play off here. But capitalism wants that waste because it's cheap, often free because it's society's discards. We don't want to think about it. And the oil and gas industry can capitalize on our negative connotations of waste, get it for cheap, and then turn it into plastics, right? So that's another way to look at this. All right, so waste having a negative connotation, we don't want to look at it, we don't want to smell it, we don't want to think about it. It's outside the norms of civil society, if you read some of Vinay's early writings on waste. But we depend on it, or capitalism depends on it, okay? And I think some of the more interesting things I've heard to validate this hypothesis was, again, at those industry conferences in which industry folks were talking about rejecting the ethane into the natural gas waste stream. They were literally burning the gas hot, which I asked them, please explain that to me as a non-engineer and a non-industry specialist. We're literally burning money by rejecting this ethane into the natural gas supply chain. And then sometimes they also had to flare it to get the pressure of the natural gas just right. So they don't want to waste money, so they wanted to find this other alternative market for this former waste byproduct. All right? But what is the environmental cost of this conversion of waste into value? All right, so now I'll bring you to the present. All right, so we're going to start from this week and work backwards. Happy Valentine's Day. The shell plant started to flare because of a equipment malfunction at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And here's a picture in the local NPR, from the local NPR website, seeing these flares. This flared for about 4 hours on Tuesday, right? Go back further. This was Christmas Day last year. One of those cryogenic facilities blew up and burned for 3 days before the public was made aware of it. My graduate students who I'm teaching, they're doing a political industrial ecology analysis of this one particular piece of infrastructure, try to understand the blast zone, if you will, of this fire. And what's sad to us is that despite the fact that this takes up a sizable portion of land, it was basically hiding in plain sight. The civil society groups that have been closely monitoring all the comings and goings of oil and natural gas in Western Pennsylvania didn't even know what this facility was because there's no public disclosure process. They see an industrial facility, but it's one of a myriad. Like think back to that metabolic tour. This thing blows up, and it wasn't until days later that they were informed that this was related to the petrochemical build-out. Okay? After the cracker plant opened, so it opened November 15, so just before Thanksgiving last year, and it was sort of stealthily done. They didn't want to give a firm date of when it was going to open because then people come and protest. But within weeks of it opening, because of equipment malfunctions and the need to flare, they blew through their annual emissions permit within a month of opening. So now they're being sued. Right, so some environmental groups, the Clean Air Council, which is based out of Philadelphia, and the Environmental Health Project, they're suing Shell and the DEP for exceeding its emissions allowance and saying that the permit shouldn't have been allowed in the first place, right? And then, of course, we have East Palestine. Let me see, I have a map. Yeah, so this is the train derailment that happened on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border a couple weeks back. And that's some pictures of the controlled release that happened. So basically this train derailed and the EPA came in and said, we'll just puncture the cars, drain the vinyl chloride into ditches and then flare it, thinking that that was the safest way to deal with this potential contaminant. And here's a picture of the smoke from that controlled release. And just to show you here, so the arrow is where East Palestine is, and I'm so glad you have the monitors in front of you because you can see the railway line where it was riding. I want you to follow that down, and you see the purple there. Monaca is where the Shell petrochemical plant is. I have that in the second arrow. If you go to Conway, that's the rail yard where this train, I think, was ultimately going. So I can't say that this is definitively related to the Shell plant, but it's part of that railway expansion that happened because Shell was coming to town. So what they're actually doing along this stretch of the Ohio River Valley is building out a bunch of industrial facilities. In addition to the Shell plant, there's a BASF plant there and a few other chemical manufacturing facilities. From a critical geography perspective, we often talk about them as sacrifice zones. And this map shows you what that means. So this is a map from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. This is their environmental justice map. And what it does is identify vulnerable areas under the EJ policy that Pennsylvania has. That is communities at the census tract level that are 20% at or below the federal poverty line and or 30% of the community identifies as URM. My main argument is that most of the way that we value EJ in Pennsylvania, the way that we define it and measure it, does not capture what happens in oil and gas landscapes. As you see on the Pennsylvania border just from East Palestine, none of those are EJ areas, but that area right around the cracker plant is designated an EJ area. So the areas in purple meet that EJ threshold, right? And these are communities, some of these areas are communities of color. Aliquippa, which is just south of the Conway line, that is a primarily black community, one of the few in Western Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh there. All right, so there's just a question here that the cryogenic facility that caught on fire Christmas Day. That was hiding in plain sight. And now these chemical trains, or these trains that are carrying toxic chemicals, are also coming through the area and not being monitored, right? And the community groups I've worked with have called these things bomb trains for years out of fears that just this was going to happen, all right? So if I were to characterize the opinions and the feelings of the people in this area of Western Pennsylvania, it's a feeling of resignation that they know that this was going to happen. They've been telling the government since time immemorial, but nobody is listening to them, all right? So there's, it's a sense of resignation, and I will hope to capture more of that next year when I spend longer periods of time out there with the communities. All right, so just getting towards some conclusions here, because I really like your questions and feedback. Some political industrial ecology points of view here. All right, so when we view this petrochemical build out as more than just the shell plant and as that broader ecosystem, what do we see that's obscured from, just like a single point in time look? So I think we see this concerted effort to build a more globally integrated market for natural gas and natural gas byproducts like ethane. You can also see the larger spatial footprint of this whole corridor, all right? And we want to look at that in two ways. That, a lot of times these individual features are collapsed to single points on a map. They're way bigger than that. The shell plant, 1,000 acres of land, and just now multiply that by thinking back through that whole metabolic tour. There's a lot of land involved here. And so I think that in some ways, this integrated look affords us, a better view on the human environmental systems that are interacting and transformed as a result of this petrochemical build out, right? And then I think that this can also be an environmental justice roadmap, and like the drum that I'm constantly beating at the DEP is that EJ analysis isn't just an urban community of color issue. It's also an issue in rural energy landscapes. And if we don't understand this supply chain perspective and this integrated approach of how potentially contaminating waterways in rural Pennsylvania might influence water quality in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, then we're never going to do good on our part to rid the world of environmental injustices, right? So that's what I'm trying to do on these various EJ boards on which I serve. All right? So that is just some thoughts I have. Perhaps you're now happy that you're not living in Pennsylvania, but just remember, a half an hour to the northeast here, Marcus Hook, right? So thank you for your time, and I'm really happy to answer questions that you might have.
Question, but I'll monitor Zoom so you're sure. If you're on Zoom, you can type in any of your questions, but we'll start with any questions in the room.
Yes.
Okay. I feel like I've already talked so much in our seminar today, but
No.
I was just curious because I'm thinking about also the supply chain and what it takes to put something like a plant, like the cracker plant, in place. And I'm not well enough in the know about how our petroleum industries control different parts of the supply chain, but I'm wondering, like, how much of that do they control in order to make a plant like that come together so quickly?
So that would be a very good research project. So which I've worked extensively with Erica Weinthal down at Duke. She's a political scientist, and a project that we have tinkered about tossed about for years is, let's try to figure out how many companies actually work on a particular component of a supply chain, because what happens is they subcontract out to avoid the environmental risks. So I guarantee you, like when Conway Phillips is ultimately taken to court because of the train derailment in East Palestine, the company who is ultimately responsible will be a shell company with no assets. And it's going to take a whole lot of forensic accounting to get down to that and to figure out the different layers. So it's regulatory loopholes in some ways that speaks to the power of industry.
That's deeply depressing. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Question for you. I found it just really interesting thinking about Marcus Hook and shipping it to Scotland.
Yeah.
So what are they actually shipping, and how in the world can it be affordable to have a shipping cost across the Atlantic?
Yeah, I know. So they're literally putting the ethane, and so liquefied ethane, they're putting that on ships and sending it across to Scotland because, that was probably an industry in Scotland that was built when North Sea oil was more productive, but that's steadily declined. So they probably have this rusting, aging infrastructure and just think, hey, we should buy it where we can get it so that we can keep this plastics manufacturing afloat.
And the same thing, they're manufacturing plastics in Scotland.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating
Yeah.
to think how can it all be profitable with all the shipping.
I know. Well, from what I understand, like shipping isn't so expensive when you put it on barges and send it across the ocean at a slow rate of speed. It's the ports that's expensive because that's the safety risk. You don't want, we don't want things to blow up, but you see how good or not we are at that.
And one last comment, this is a beautiful map that you showed. So for all of us, it's a beautiful map in terms of thinking about the background and everything that kind of pops on it. So it's just
Thank you. I will convey that to Harrison.
that's beautiful.
I will let you know. And I will tell you something else that happened. So like I'm in the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences at Penn State. So critical geographer in a department with the petroleum and gas engineers. There's an annual fundraising gala and they ask one person from each department to come and like schmooze. And I was like, that sounds so cool. I just want to see it from a human geography perspective. I just had this map on a poster, no words to say what I was doing. Because of course there's going to be all these folks from the oil and gas industry. And they looked at this and they said, oh, you got it right. Because this is hard to do. So because all of these components are regulated separately. And so again, it goes back to that saying or that feedback from that one community member. The plant is more than just a plant, but we don't know what the whole puzzle is. Because these pieces of infrastructure keep popping up in their communities. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. And they don't know left from right. They describe it as whiplash. And that is also by design. So one of the things I'm trying to do on my time off next year is to literally build a database of the different permits, which is no small feat. So I'm going to work with folks from the law school. But then that idea that cryogenic facility that blew up on Christmas Day, that was literally hiding in plain sight with 40 plus environmental groups that have come together to try to keep eyes on Shell. And they didn't know that this was part of this petrochemical build out. So I'm going to try to use remote sensing, which I also don't know how to do, but I got tenure, so I guess I'm supposed to branch out and learn new methods now. But I'm going to try to use Google Earth Engine and figure out where these other cryogenic facilities might exist in the Ohio River Valley so we get a better sense of what actually has been inscribed on the ground. I think there's a question on chat now. Oh, okay.
That was me saying that question. I used to work for Clean Air Council in the Mariner East Pipeline.
Okay.
But for the groups that you're planning to work with out west, are there other like specific data questions that they have, like that they've told you like these information that we really need?
Okay, so something that was really interesting to me, like I've shown these maps to some of the community groups, and they said like you're over mapping us because we don't understand how to use these. So I'm like, okay, that's really good feedback. What they want is somebody to sit down with them and like explain what these maps represent, and then also what the data are, because anybody who works in energy, I mean, it has its own lingo. Like what's a BTU, what's an MMBTU, and then burning hot, rejection into the waste streams, like what the heck is all this? So they need that kind of primer analysis. So I plan to, as part of interviews, gather feedback on what knowledge would be helpful for them. And then, like the permit database that I want to build, make that publicly available for them too.
Of course, I have a really general question. What we can do right now for Pennsylvania is, should we just closing everything and ended up using this petroleum or something? What do you think?
Well, I think that, does anybody read Matt Huber's work as well? So he's another very prominent energy geographer at Syracuse. So he has a really good paper in the Annals. I want to say it's 2015. So he talks about industrial political ecology, that we need to be putting more pressure on industry to change their practices. Because what the neoliberalization of environmental governance, what would that lead us to think here? Oh, it's our responsibility to do our part and use fewer plastics. But look what's happening. Okay, we don't use plastics here in Delaware or in Pennsylvania. Well, look at this pipeline network. Well, we're just going to get them to Canada, to the Gulf Coast, or over to Scotland, right? So we need to be fixing our gaze on the industrial sector and trying to use governance tools, I think, to actually regulate them. And my husband, he's a finance professor, and we chat about this stuff all the time. And one of our friends from grad school, also a finance professor, but he's working down in DC now because the oil and gas industry thinks that the writing is on the wall that there is going to be a carbon tax. And so their lobby is out in full force trying to get ahead of it so they can set the terms and conditions of what a carbon tax might be. And so we've been thinking about, my husband and I have been thinking about this, is like, that might be the death nail in the coffin to prevent a further expansion of this petrochemical corridor in the Ohio River Valley, because if you price the cost of carbon into a loan project for another petrochemical facility, the interest rate will probably be cost prohibitive and companies are going to walk away. And lo and behold, some large international petrochemical conglomerates who got permit approval to break ground in Ohio and West Virginia did indeed walk away from the projects because they couldn't get the financing. Shell self-financed, so that's why their project is live, but that might be the only one. And who would have thought that like Goldman Sachs comes to the rescue? But it seems like that might happen, and that's another project, that's another rabbit hole I want to go down next year.
Thanks for a great talk, and I always like to see somebody from Penn State because that's where I got my degree. But I'm always fascinated by this whole thing with fracking and everything that is happening. And I just wondered whether anybody up there at Penn State, I know there's kind of the Center for Marcellus Shale and so on.
Closed.
Yeah, okay. Back in the late 1800s, there was another environmental, really big event that took place in the area now where fracking is happening, and that was the logging boom. And it was a tremendous, in many ways, environmental disaster, but things have grown back now, etc. And I just wondered, there's a lot of similarities in some ways that you can see, and I wonder if there's human geographers, social geographers, other people really looking at kind of that connection, going back and kind of looking at what happened in the past and what's happening now?
Yeah, so I teach that connection in my energy policy classes because it's part of the boomtown model, and you can also argue as a form of what we see in places that are so tethered to the extractive industries that it becomes a form of resource curse, that once your economy becomes so dependent on being an extractor, that's what you just keep doing because it's what you know well, but it's also, you get this reputation where you've given the tax breaks to the industry and then they feel like a friendly face that keeps coming back for more. And so you get locked into these patterns. Another thing that is happening in Pennsylvania is that they do have a climate action plan and they are trying to go big on solar, particularly utility scale solar. I have concerns about that we're going to be walking back into a food versus fuel security challenge, because where are they citing the solar farms, the dairy farms, also in southeastern Pennsylvania.
The other thing about it is, northern Pennsylvania, when I was growing up there, prided itself on its environment and people coming up there to enjoy the environment. Now you go up to northern Pennsylvania and it's a wreck.
Yep.
I mean, it's like it's been traded from one, we're all about this, to now we're just going to destroy that and go another direction. And I don't quite understand it.
Yep, and we literally have an environmental rights amendment in our Constitution, in the state constitution, that the environment has agency, and environmental groups use the environmental rights amendment to sue industry, but yet we keep seeing these patterns over and over. And my political ecology hat is on here, and it's like the pernicious side of private property rights, because what is exacerbating or what is enabling the spread of fracking? The ability of private landowners to lease their lands for the mineral rights. So the U.S. is the only nation in the world that allows the mineral rights to flow to the property owner and not to the crown or to the state. So the individual landowners have a whole heck of a lot of power, if you will, in shaping the trajectories of an industrial boom like this. And I just read a good chapter in a book that I reviewed recently. It's called When Fracking Comes to Town. And there was a book there was a chapter in there about how environmental justice laws fail Appalachia. And the author's main point is that Appalachia is a region that is land rich but cash poor. So the landowners are really eager to lease their lands for fracking because they're having a hard time making it day to day. And I totally empathize with that. So I am from the Scranton area. I'm just outside the Marcellus, and the area is very elderly. And I can't tell you how many of my relatives who are solid Democrats, I mean, this is where Biden was born. Like, if we are just sad that we aren't in Susquehanna County, because we would have leased our land in a second, because I hate in the winter having to decide between paying for groceries and heating my home, you know? So that's what's happening across rural Pennsylvania. And I think that we need to better incorporate those perspectives into our EJ analysis, because the Biden administration, to their credit, you can love them or hate them, but they're putting a lot of money in place for environmental justice projects. And like, this is an area where Pennsylvania really has to strike to, you know, make some corrections.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you all for your questions. I will invite the faculty to head out, and the grad students can continue the conversation, and I'll remind you that we'll head over to happy hour here when the grad students are done.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Okay.